The bottle had a beautiful label. A mother cradling her sleeping infant. Soft colors. Gentle words. Perfectly harmless, it promised. Pleasant to taste. 1 teaspoon, the instructions said, and your crying baby would finally sleep. What the label didn't say, what no label ever said, was that 1 teaspoon contained enough morphine to kill a grown man. In Manchester, 1865, a 20-year-old lace worker named Mary Cotton held that bottle in her hands. Her baby was screaming. She hadn't slept in 3 days. The factory bell would ring in 4 hours, and if she missed another shift, they'd both starve. She measured out the dose. She watched her daughter's eyes grow heavy. She watched the crying stop. And then she went to work. This scene played out in thousands of homes across Victorian England. Every single day. For decades. The medicine was called soothing syrup. It was sold in every chemist, every corner shop, every market stall in the country. Mothers bought it by the millions. Doctors recommended it. Advertisements showed happy, peaceful babies sleeping in their mother's arms. What they didn't show were the tiny coffins. Thousands of children died. Some estimate the number is closer to 10,000. Maybe more. We'll never know exactly, because no one was counting. No one was paying attention. And the worst part? Doctors knew. They had known for years. And they said nothing. This is the story of how Victorian England poisoned its own children, legally, openly, and with a smile on the label. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Victorian childhood looked like for the poor. In the industrial cities, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, Leeds, families lived in conditions we can barely imagine today. A single room for 6, 8, 10 people. No running water. No sanitation. And no support. When a woman had a baby, she didn't get maternity leave. That concept didn't exist. She got a few days, maybe a week if she was lucky, and then she was back at the factory. 14 hours a day. 6 days a week. Her fingers working the looms while her milk dried up and her baby screamed at home. Who watched the babies while the mothers worked? Sometimes older children, girls as young as 5 or 6, tasked with keeping an infant alive until their mother came home. Sometimes neighbors, elderly women who watched multiple babies for a few pennies each. Sometimes no one at all. Babies were left alone, swaddled tightly, placed in wooden boxes, expected to simply wait. But babies don't wait quietly. Babies cry. They cry from hunger. They cry from wet napkins. They cry from teething, from colic, from the simple overwhelming confusion of being alive. And a crying baby was a disaster. If you were a childminder watching 6 babies at once, one screaming infant could set off all the others. If you were a mother working piece rate at a factory, a sleepless night meant slower fingers, which meant less money, which meant less food. If you were living in a tenement with paper-thin walls, a crying baby could get you evicted. Desperate people will reach for any solution. And the Victorians had one. Walk into any chemist shop in 1850s England, and you'd find an entire shelf dedicated to infant medicines. The bottles were beautiful. The labels were reassuring. The names were designed to calm anxious mothers. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. Godfrey's Cordial. Street's Infants Quietness. Atkinson's Royal Infants Preservative. Dalby's Carminative. At least 10 major brands competed for the market. And they all had one thing in common. They all contained opium. Godfrey's Cordial, the most popular, was a mixture of opium, treacle, water, and spices. Sweet enough that babies would swallow it willingly. Strong enough that they'd stop crying within minutes. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup was even more potent. Each fluid ounce contained 65 milligrams of morphine, a concentrated derivative of opium. 1 teaspoon held the equivalent of 20 drops of laudanum. To put that in perspective, medical guidelines of the time suggested that babies under 6 months receive no more than 2 or 3 drops of laudanum for severe pain. 1 teaspoon of Mrs. Winslow's contained enough morphine to kill the average infant. And the recommended dose? 3 to 4 times daily. These weren't back-alley products sold by criminals. They were mainstream medicines, advertised in newspapers, printed on calendars, promoted by respectable companies. Mrs. Winslow's alone sold over 1.5 million bottles per year by 1868. And here's what made it even worse: nobody knew what was in them. Patent medicines weren't required to list their ingredients. The labels showed happy babies. The advertisements promised peaceful sleep. The word opium appeared nowhere. Mothers had no idea they were drugging their children with one of the most addictive substances on earth. Let me tell you about Mary Cotton. She was 20 years old in 1861, working as a lace maker in Nottingham. The work paid almost nothing, a few shillings a week if she worked fast enough. She had a baby daughter, 3 months old, and no husband. He had died of consumption 6 weeks after the baby was born. Mary loved her daughter. The accounts make this clear. She spent what little money she had on good cloth for the baby's blankets. She walked 2 miles each way to work rather than pay for transport, so she could save a few extra pennies for food. But she couldn't stop the baby from crying. The neighbor who watched her daughter during work hours had started complaining. The baby screamed constantly, she said. It was disrupting her own children. If Mary couldn't keep the infant quiet, she'd have to find someone else. There was no one else. A woman at the factory told Mary about Godfrey's Cordial. Everyone used it, she said. Her own children had been raised on it. A few drops and the baby would sleep right through. No more crying. No more complaints. 2 pennies a bottle, less than the price of a pint of beer. Mary resisted at first. Something about it felt wrong to her. The baby seemed drowsy after the doses, her eyes unfocused, her movements slow. Mary tried to stop giving it to her. But then the crying started again. And the neighbor's threats started again. And the factory wouldn't let her bring the baby to work. And there was no one else to watch her. So Mary kept dosing her daughter. A few drops in the morning. A few drops at midday. A few drops at night. And she watched her baby change. The infant stopped gaining weight. She became listless, uninterested in feeding. Her skin took on a grayish pallor. She slept more and more, but it wasn't the peaceful sleep of a healthy baby. It was something else. Something wrong. Mary later described her daughter as looking like a tiny old woman. Other mothers would use similar words: wizened, shrunken, like little monkeys. The babies were starving. Not because their mothers weren't feeding them, but because opium suppresses appetite. Infants kept in a constant state of sedation simply stopped wanting to eat. They wasted away slowly, their small bodies consuming themselves, while the mothers had no idea what was happening. When Mary's daughter died at 7 months old, the death certificate listed the cause as debility and failure to thrive. The bottle of Godfrey's Cordial sitting on Mary's shelf was never mentioned. Mary Cotton's story was not unusual. It was typical. In Manchester alone, one druggist admitted to selling half a gallon of Godfrey's Cordial every week, plus 5 to 6 additional gallons of a generic version called Quietness. That's one shop. 1 week. In one city. In Nottingham, a single town councillor, who was also a druggist, sold 400 gallons of laudanum annually. A medical survey in the 1860s estimated that 5 out of 6 working-class families in Manchester used opium-based medicines habitually. Not occasionally. Habitually. The effects were devastating. Dr. Greenough, investigating infant mortality for the Privy Council in 1861, found infants across the industrial north who had been kept in continuous sedation for months. He described children who were wizened like little monkeys, wasted to skin and bone, barely able to lift their heads. Children kept in a state of continued narcotism, he wrote, will be thereby disinclined for food, and be but imperfectly nourished. They weren't dying of overdoses, at least, not usually. They were dying of starvation. Slowly. Over weeks and months. While their mothers watched helplessly, not understanding why their babies wouldn't eat. The coroner's records tell the story. Cause of death, debility. Wasting. Failure to thrive. Convulsions. Teething. Teething was listed as a cause of death for thousands of Victorian infants, because doctors believed the pain of teething was so severe that babies could die from it. In reality, these were often opium deaths. The teething babies had been dosed with soothing syrup to stop their crying, and they never woke up. Thomas Bull, a physician, compiled the data in 1854. He estimated that 3/4 of all deaths from opium occurred in children under 5. But here's what makes this truly unforgivable. The doctors knew. Medical officers had been raising alarms about infant opium poisoning since the 1840s. In 1840, a doctor named Jeffreys published Observations on the Improper Use of Opium in England, in The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world. He documented case after case of infant death and addiction. He named the soothing syrup specifically. He called for immediate regulation. Nothing happened. In 1854, Thomas Bull published Hints to Mothers, in which he explicitly warned against Godfrey's Cordial and similar preparations. He documented 12 infant deaths directly linked to the cordial over just 2 years. Sales continued to climb. In 1861, Dr. Greenough submitted his devastating report to the Privy Council. He provided overwhelming evidence that opium was one of the major causes of infant mortality in England. He described the industrial scale of the problem. He begged for action. The government commissioned more studies. By the 1860s, the medical establishment knew that thousands of children were dying. The evidence was irrefutable. The pattern was clear. The solution was obvious: regulate the sale of opium-based infant medicines. So why didn't they? Money. Chemists and druggists made enormous profits from soothing syrups. One Manchester druggist testified that various forms of opium constituted a major part of their trade. Regulation would cost them dearly. When Parliament proposed the Pharmacy Act in 1868, a bill that would restrict the sale of dangerous drugs, the trading chemists launched an intensive lobbying campaign. They argued that regulation was impractical. They claimed it would harm legitimate business. They pressured members of Parliament. And they won. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was passed, but in a dramatically weakened form. It limited the sale of opium derivatives to registered chemists. But it explicitly exempted patent medicines. Godfrey's Cordial. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. All the branded products that were killing children by the thousands. All of them remained perfectly legal, completely unregulated, available to anyone with a few pennies. The exemption was lobbied for by the very companies profiting from infant deaths. And Parliament agreed. Not every child who was dosed with soothing syrup died. Some survived. But survival came with its own horrors. Infants who were given opium regularly became addicted, physically dependent on the drug before they could walk or talk. When the medicine was withheld, they went through withdrawal. The symptoms were identical to what we now see in babies born to opioid-addicted mothers: tremors, excessive crying, seizures, fever, diarrhea. Victorian doctors documented these cases without fully understanding what they were seeing. They described babies who became irritable and inconsolable when the soothing syrup ran out. Babies who screamed for hours, who wouldn't eat, who couldn't sleep, until another dose was given. The mothers interpreted this as proof that the medicine was necessary. The baby was clearly suffering without it. So they bought another bottle. And another. And another. The cycle of addiction began in infancy and continued for years. But addiction wasn't the worst of it. Children who survived chronic opium exposure often suffered permanent damage. Medical reports from the era described survivors as dull, listless, showing signs of what we would now recognize as developmental delays and cognitive impairment. The drug had been affecting their brains during the most critical period of development. Dr. Jordan, a modern researcher who studied Victorian infant drugging, concluded that opium-related infant mortality, deficiency diseases, and retardation were widespread, though impossible to quantify precisely. We have no way of knowing how many children survived with damaged minds. How many grew up slower, duller, less capable than they might have been. How many struggled in school, struggled in work, struggled in life, never knowing that a bottle of medicine had stolen their potential before they were old enough to remember. The Victorians didn't track this. They didn't connect the dots. The children simply grew up, diminished. And no one counted them at all. Change came slowly. Too slowly. And too late for thousands of children already in the ground. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had exempted patent medicines, but it did create some restrictions. Opium could only be sold by registered chemists, not corner shops or general stores. Sales had to be recorded. The drug became slightly harder to obtain. The effect was measurable. Deaths among children under 5 from opium dropped from 20.5 per million between 1863 to 1867 to 12.7 per million by 1871. By the 1880s, the rate had fallen to between 6 and 7 per million. But the decline wasn't because of the law. Not really. What changed was public awareness. The British Medical Association began publishing lists of dangerous patent medicines. Newspapers ran exposés on the ingredients in soothing syrups. Reformers distributed pamphlets warning mothers about the poisons they were giving their children. Education did what legislation wouldn't. Mothers, once they knew what was in the bottles, began to refuse. Not all of them, poverty still forced impossible choices, but enough. Demand dropped. Sales declined. And then, in 1906, everything changed. The United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required patent medicines to list their ingredients on the label. For the first time, mothers could see the word morphine printed on the bottles they'd been giving their babies. Sales collapsed. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was forced to remove morphine from its formula and drop the word soothing from its name. In 1911, the American Medical Association formally denounced the product, calling it unsafe and directly linking it to infant deaths. The company continued selling a reformulated version until the 1930s. In Britain, the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 finally made opium and its derivatives controlled substances. Soothing syrups as they had existed, legal infant narcotics sold without restriction, became illegal at last. By then, the damage was incalculable. How many children died? We don't know. We'll never know. The official statistics are fragments. Between 1863 and 1867, 292 children under 5 died from what coroners specifically identified as opiate poisoning. But those were only the obvious cases, the overdoses, the accidents, the deaths that couldn't be explained any other way. The thousands of children who starved slowly, recorded as debility. The thousands who wasted away, failure to thrive. The thousands whose hearts simply stopped in the night, crib death. Estimates from medical historians range from several thousand to over 10,000 deaths directly attributable to infant opium medicines across the Victorian era. Some believe the true number is higher still. And that's just the deaths. It doesn't count the addicted, the damaged, the diminished. It doesn't count Mary Cotton's daughter, who died at 7 months old without ever knowing why her mother kept giving her that sweet-tasting medicine that made everything so quiet. It doesn't count the mothers who blamed themselves for the rest of their lives, who stood over tiny graves and wondered what they had done wrong, never knowing that the answer was sitting on their kitchen shelf, wrapped in a beautiful label with a picture of a sleeping baby. The Victorians called it progress. Industry. Efficiency. They built an economy that required mothers to work 14-hour days within weeks of giving birth. They created conditions where babies were left alone for hours, where crying infants were threats to survival, where desperate women would reach for any solution. And then they sold them poison. Legally. Openly. With a smile on the label. If this story made you feel something, anger, heartbreak, disbelief, leave a comment and tell me which part hit you hardest. And if this is your first time here, Soot and Silk tells the stories of Victorian lives that history forgot. The mothers. The children. The ones who suffered in silence so the factories could keep running. Subscribe if you want to remember them with me. Because someone should.